So if you're as paranoid about all those common attack issues that we saw in the last episode, then stay tuned to find out how to mitigate them.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome back to GSEC. We're going to see how to protect ourselves against some of those common attack mechanisms. And, well, to start off, I say we start at the top of the list. Injection attacks. Daniel, is it really that hard to protect against injection attacks?
Well, it can be hard to find them, right? I think that's the difficulty. But anytime that you are looking at like an eval statement or something to that effect, anytime you're calling the system to do something for you, well, Justin, we have you here, so we can kind of lean on your knowledge when it comes to this. We're talking about evaluation, right? As a user, I'm sending some input to the system. The system is taking that in, and then it's working on it. It's manipulating. It's doing something with it. When it comes to things like eval or system or popen, all these types of commands that will actually run what I'm telling it, that's where I got to be on the lookout for, right?
That's dynamic programming languages are horrible. Python, Perl,
Yeah.
PHP, anything that a lot of times are these scripting languages that you'll use for server-side applications. Even if it doesn't look like you're doing an evaluation where it slurps in just random text and does an eval, sometimes it happens. So as far as code and command execution, you just have to be diligent. Just assume someone's out to get you all the time. Secondly, as programmers, we tend to do this horrible thing where we go, I want to take that user input, I want to build this more complicated command, SQL also included here, smash it together with plus signs or whatever your concatenation operation. In PHP, it's the period. And we go, cool, it looks fine. SQL injection, all day long. You either have to sanitize or you have to use special utilities for what are called parameterized statements, or have like wildcards and they're replaced. And behind the scenes, your programming language of choice is probably going to do that sanitization. They're easy to fix as long as it's in the forefront of your mind. In addition to, you should probably do some static code analysis to help find those.
So I would say that is probably the biggest issue when it comes to these injection types of attacks, is trying to get the programmers to think in a way that is security minded instead of just, hey, let's get this to work. While I totally understand that, like I need a viable product that actually does something, and I can see the temptation to want to just get it working and then come back later and then start working on things like parameterized statements and having filtering, whitelisting, that kind of stuff. These are all good mitigation tactics, but if we're not employing them, then we're going to leave ourselves open for attack through that avenue. So what do I mean by that? Well, filtering, I can say, hey, don't allow these special characters. All right, let's jump back into the DVWA here on my machine. And if you look at any of these pages, it does have this little button down here, view source. So we can actually see the source code, right? And there is our SQL statement for this one, right? Right there. And it says where user ID equals ID, and ID is being taken in from PHP right around that area. It's not doing anything else. It's just whatever you give me, I'll put it in this statement, and there you go. I could do things like if the ID contains these characters, like a single quote or a hashtag or a double quote or something, anything that isn't normal, I can remove those, strip them off, and then allow the rest of it. Or I can just say, hey, you've entered something invalid. Please try again. These are the things that we can do to try to help with that. And then of course, going into parameter statements where it is starting to limit what it is that actually gets passed. It's kind of asking you, which one of these options do you want to run? I think if we increase the security on this, let's go to DVWA security. We'll crank the security level to, let's just go to high. Why not? Now that's on high, we'll go back to SQL injection. And you'll notice now, click here to change your ID, which pops open a new window. And then I have the submit form. So it's starting to jump through different hoops to make these changes. I thought an interesting one was, I think if you put it on medium, there we go. Let's go back. DVWA security, click that down to medium, hit submit. This is a very common way to see this. Now, this is the only way I can choose my ID. It gives me a drop down. Again, there are ways around this, but it's a very good start to mitigate these types of injection attacks.
And I think that's one of those things where you shouldn't make it easy for people, right? This in particular prevents against the whoops, I copy and pasted something from a forum, or just maybe non-sophisticated.
Yeah.
But I'll tell you, if you're like, oh, this will fix everything, I assure you it will not, because a very sophisticated attacker will go, let me just intercept that request. Changey, doodad, bam.
Yep.
You still have the same SQL injection that you did on the low. You still need to sanitize on your server-side application, because that's the only place that you have full control of. Now, speaking of these unbeknownst kind of secret eval, regular expressions. We talked about it in the previous one.
We did.
They're prime for denial of service.
Yeah.
And part of that is because behind the scenes, there's like the secret eval that you're taking user input, and then
it's evaling it. Honestly, how weird.
yeah, I know, but it doesn't look like that if you're using regular expression engines, and then you end up with this like blow up, like this look back or whatever, and it eats up all your resources. But how do we mitigate against the non-injection based, like a DDoS, DOS type things?
So when it comes to denial of service attacks or distributed denial of service attacks, a couple of things that you could do when it comes to maybe you have a web application. We actually ran through this here at IT Pro TV. We had a denial of service attack or a distributed denial of service attack. And the problem ended up being that it was easy for them to hammer our login page. They hammered the login page so hard that we were unable to work with those requests to actually have the server, what's the word I'm looking for? Process, thank you. Process those requests. So what did we do? We just implemented a simple CAPTCHA. And now you have to click, I'm a human kind of thing, right? Or how many street signs are on this page? Well, that stops that type of attack. That's one way that you could do it. Saw another denial of service attack that went against another business in town's proxy server. And what we did was we engaged a web application firewall. And it was great at that. So there's a couple of mitigation techniques you can use. If it starts seeing traffic that it's unable to handle, that web application firewall could come in, or maybe you have a next-gen firewall that can see this looks like denial of service traffic and just cuts it off. And then you're able to go in and do things like black hole from that specific IP range. Maybe you've got, I'm getting a lot of attack traffic coming from Russia. So I'm just going to stop Russia from being able to contact my system. So these are the things we can do to help slow these things down until we figure out a more permanent solution, because it's really going to depend on the type of attack that you're experiencing on how you would mitigate them.
Interestingly enough, I had something happen at my personal residence.
Really?
I got a denial of service. I don't know if it was distributed or not. Found a lot of traffic from Romania. Yeah, and
What were they going for?
I don't know. I think they were just poking around in like
yeah.
IP block ranges, and they're like,
Yeah.
"Oh, look what's going on." So yeah, stop that in a hurry. But it was because I was a more savvy user. That's not typical. Typically, they're going after businesses because that's meaningful. But speaking of individuals and all these weak links and non-sophisticated users, passwords.
The soup du jour, right? They will get you every time. Now, the good news is we've already kind of covered this ground, so I'm not going to belabor the idea of how to secure your passwords. Use secure password policies, right? Implement them. Make sure that your company is following them. Make sure you're doing your own vulnerability assessment against your passwords, checking and see if any kind of low-hanging fruit is going to get past the system. So those are just a couple of mitigations you can employ right there. I implement a password policy that has the acceptable complexity, dictionary, rule sets that we need to apply to make sure that strong passwords are being used. I can also, of course, implement something like multi-factor authentication, which will help mitigate most password attacks, if not all of them. It's very, very difficult, although not impossible, to get around multi-factor authentication. It will definitely and drastically reduce your attack surface when it comes to weak passwords.
Well, so the passwords thing, there's always the human link, so you're going to give your best effort.
There's that.
But, something I've never understood is how do we protect or mitigate against man-in-the-middle attacks?
That's a really good question as well. Man in the middle. What do we do? Well, when we talked about our example of man in the middle, we talked about ARP, right? So with ARP spoofing, I was taking advantage of the idea that the system was dynamically updating. It was trying to do it automatically for me so that I as an end user don't have to deal with it. We use that kind of stuff all the time. DHCP, DNS, right? All these things try to do their job without having our input. Just kind of does it for us. Well, with ARP, maybe you go in and you set a static table. And yes, that is more administrative effort on our part. But if that juice is worth the squeeze, maybe you want to go in there and make that happen. Maybe you have some way to script that out so it's a little bit easier of a lift for you. But ultimately, you're going to spend some more time. Will that stop everything? No, it's not going to. As Justin has alluded to, as we all have, make sure that you are layering that defense. So we're going to talk about that in another episode where we're going to look at defense in depth, right? But these are going to be tactics that we bolt on to try to reduce the attack surface when it comes to something like a man-in-the-middle attack. Don't use hubs, and don't allow the traffic to go to where it's not going. Maybe I set up a table inside of the switching so that the network can handle some of that action. Firewalls, that can handle some of that, right? So it's all about doing a little more administrative lifting, but once you get that done, it should help with that attack surface.
Speaking of firewall, maybe some filtering, is that a common mitigation against like phishing, or are there other things that we can use to like keep phishing from being a problem, which is a problem because people are involved?
Yeah, phishing is a difficult thing. We have spam filters that will try to pick up on the fact that this might be endpoint protection. Can also do this. They got all these next-gen devices that you can plug into your network nowadays, or implement on a server-client basis that does a bunch of check-ins and things that are looking for those telltale signs of phishing attacks. So it's looking at emails, it's looking at links, it's knowing where those attack domains are from and updating them, right? So those are great ways to help mitigate against phishing attacks. One of the best ways that you can help mitigate against phishing is user awareness training. Make sure your users are trained sufficiently. You're never going to hit the apex of that mountain. I'm sorry, it's just not going to happen. Again, that's why we add these things together, so that it helps with those mitigations. But if my users know what to look for, and we bury it in their brain that don't click on links, as enticing as they may look, always do things like hover to discover. Let's go back over to my little phishing email that I created, right? I have that, please log in here, and I'll see if I can, you notice that when I hover over that, it's going to pay.pal.c2server.ru/ such and such. Well, what's that? It's definitely not PayPal. It kind of looks like PayPal, but it's not PayPal. If I can train my users to look at this type of information as they get ready to click that link, maybe they'd be a little less apt to actually just start clicking on stuff. So me teaching them that, hey, malware gets in this way, credentials get harvested this way. So be very standoffish when it comes to clicking links. Always just go to that website, log in normally. If someone calls you, go, hey, let me call the company right back. Hey, I'm from your bank. Great, I'll call you. Hang up, call your bank. Someone just contacted me from here and said that I was having trouble with my account. No, sir, not that we see. Ah, great, now I know. It's trust but verify, right? So just because there's a link in there and it seems legit doesn't mean you should go through there. A couple other things as well, is there were some spelling errors, telltale signs of it being a phish. As Justin kind of pointed out, this could be used to get around those algorithms that those firewalls use to try to stop this action. So use your best judgment, and that's kind of what it's going to boil down to at the end of the day.
Just remember, phishing is going to appeal to your emotions.
Yeah.
Typically fear.
It's a social engineer.
Yeah, it's a social engineering thing. And also, those links, that pay.pal.c2server.ru, fairly conspicuous.
Yeah.
Do be aware that some more sophisticated individuals will try to find places that have domain names that they can buy there like a letter off, right? Especially if you have a very long domain name. I can typically find something that's really close. Just look at the word commercial. I can buy it with one M. Still really close, right? And people go, yep, looks good.
As you kind of glance over that, your eye just fills that second M in. You don't even see it.
Because you expect to see that M. Now, we're talking about users kind of layering on these things, but eavesdropping, that's something that I haven't necessarily thought a great deal about. So I'm interested, like, what layered prevention, or is there any, for protecting against eavesdropping?
Encryption.
There you go.
That's really what's going to help us out most when it comes to eavesdropping, because you got to remember, we're looking at the wire, we're looking at the data that's crossing the wire. If I'm able to see what that data is, I can effectively eavesdrop on that system. But if I've encrypted it, then yeah, you could be man in the middle all day long unless you've got the encryption keys to decrypt it, which is possible, but it made it more difficult, right? It's another layer that you have to go through to get at that information. So just by the fact that you're encrypting maybe with strong encryption, at least as strong as you can, depending on what the system is, that is going to be your best safety guard against an eavesdropping attack. So don't use things like Telnet. Don't use things like FTP, as convenient as they might be. You'll notice that that tends to be a sliding scale of convenience versus security. Right? It's not always, right? The analogy isn't perfect, but a lot of times, the better the convenience, the less the security, and vice versa. Right? So instead, use things like SSH to do remote logins. Use things like secure copy instead of FTP or SFTP, right? Which will encrypt that information and no longer allow someone to just glean it off of the network. So, and it's an easy lift to do. It doesn't really cost us anything to go, I'm going to use SSH now instead of Telnet. I'm going to use SFTP instead of FTP from now on. You just enable the service, configure it, and use it as you would any other thing. It's a pretty simple lift. So that would be my biggest, just use some encryption.
Okay, all right. I'm good with encryption. It's something that I've started to use a lot more as I'm, getting a little more paranoid as I get older. Something that I had trouble with when I was younger, though, right? We all get that first computer. We started clicking on, ooh, a game. I'll have malware.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Sub 7.
Yeah. Look, man, it's
Takes me back.
opening up all over the place. I've found that as I've grown older, I tend to be a little more cautious and haven't had as much trouble with malware. So some of that is just me. But there's times where things go awry. What are other things that we can do to limit the infection of malware or the spread of malware?
I would say this is going to be a twofold answer here, at least generally. You hit on one of the major ways in which you can do a proper understanding of how the internet works, and that there are dangers out there, and that I need to be very selective on where I go as I move through the world and the internet. Okay? Now, that's not going to save me all the way, but much like Justin, I have found that as I understand more about those things, the more I'm able to avoid things like malware. Okay? The other thing I can do is endpoint protection or antivirus, anti-malware, right? If I install a system that knows what most malware looks like, and it's running and checking all the things I download and the pages that I go to, emails that I look at, and it's looking at attachments that are on this file, and it goes, oh, that's a known virus signature, and alerts me. I have quarantined that. I have put it in the deep freezer. You're never going to see it again. Don't go after that. It's bad, 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 bad. Maybe even alert a manager that could come over, someone's part of the security team, and say, we've noticed that something kind of come across the wire there. That's going to be a great way to keep malware off of your system. Also, do things like patching and updating. A solid way to avoid malware. If it doesn't have the avenue of attack to inject or get out or do whatever, then you've closed the door on them, right? So just don't have those vulnerabilities that the malware could take advantage of. That can be a super help. One other thing I wanted to kind of just jumped in my head when we were talking about passwords. Fail to ban is another really good system. Just kind of remembered it off the top of my head. It'll stop those brute force attacks that come after things like your SSH server, RDP, Telnet, FTP, that kind of stuff. So X amount of usernames and passwords have come across the wire. It hasn't been successful. I'm just going to kill your access to this for 30 minutes or whatever. It can be super, super helpful on that attack vector, as it were. Well, there you go, Justin. Malware was also the devil in disguise. So avoid it as much as you can. Learn what malware looks like. Also, install some sort of antivirus, anti-malware system, endpoint protection. It'll help keep you out of the weeds.
And speaking of the fail to ban, always be aware of what industry you're in, because sometimes compliance requires you to have those systems in place. And if you don't, shenanigans.
Hey, compliance equals security.
No, but you know what, Daniel? I feel a little bit better.
Yeah.
I'm good. I'm going to have to go implement some of these, and you should as well. But definitely join us on back. We got more GSEC coming at you. But for now, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. So signing off for IT Pro TV, I've been your host, Justin Innocent.
I'm Daniel Lowry.
And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.